Bolton especially, like, he admitted to organizing coups, and he was like, "This isn't a coup. Like, I've organized coups. They're a lot harder to do, right? Like, just that you brag about being able to." Anyway, but like, so the typical Trump fan rhetoric is, well, Bolton was forced on him. Okay, let's say that's true. That's possible, right? Kamala Harris was forced on Biden, but he also appointed Elliott Abrams. Elliott Abrams is just a sleazier version of Bolton, or a younger version, just as sleazy as Bolton.
Probably one of Bolton's mentors, if I had to guess, someone who probably learned from Kissinger and kind of took up the torch, and one of the architects of the Iraq War, one of the architects of current Venezuela policy and the sanctions. Like, that we're talking about, these are literally people who sit around all day thinking, like, how can we make these sanctions as vicious as possible to cut off as vital of industries as we can, and to cut off medicine and things that people need so we can starve them out and turn them against their government. Like,
and
they're fucking psychopaths. I'm sorry.
They're evil. Carlos has the right word. They're
psychopaths.
And because he's like anti-Trump in his book, he's like a regular at MSNBC now.
Right. Literally. As is Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
The idea that Trump is a singular figure, all it does is takes people and puts them in a fake sort of struggle, right? Like, the Democrats and Republicans is not a real struggle, guys. They're all, like Carlos was just saying, they're all in the same club. They went to the same private schools, right? They get taught to lead, right? They get taught to rule. We get taught to work.
And it's important to notice the hypocrisy in the discourse, because the U.S. champions internationally the rules-based international order. And you have people who can literally go on, the biggest media in the country, admit that they've done coups before, brag about the difficulty of the coups that they've done, and then just nothing happens to them, right? You have these war criminals just walking around, nothing happens to them. They're not subject to U.S. law. They're not subject, to punishment by international law, which is binding in the U.S., and it's extreme. Rules-based international order ends up just meaning whatever the hell is in the interest of American monopoly capital and finance capital.
And they're not going to be held accountable for this until we do it. Organizing right now is absolutely mandatory. Now is the time. Everyone knows this stuff these days. People are becoming more and more aware. Reproletarianization is happening. All we need to do is get over our own shit, really. Right? I'm sorry to keep swearing, by the way, brothers. But we need to get over ourselves and actually create something concrete and kick these people out of power. We can do it. Half of the entire sort of propaganda apparatus is designed just to make us think we can't, right? But we absolutely can. They are people just like us. They have names, they have faces, they, drop deuces in the toilet. Like, it's the same. The only difference is they're in power and we're not yet, because they're more organized.
Thank you for the super sticker, Stephen Michael Palazzo. I appreciate that. We're almost now as rich as George Bush, who's teaching a $15 a month master class in case you want to learn how to be leadership skills and painting skills from President George W. Bush, as if you haven't given him enough of your money and resources.
For an evil sort of like psycho like he is, his painting skills are actually like on point. He's always been.
He's weirdly good.
Yeah, when I lived in LA, I dated this girl who her best friend growing up was Barbara, George W. Bush's daughter. So she was like over at the Bush house on weekends for dinners and whatnot.
Wow.
Like in the house of a mass murderer. I asked her about that and she was like, He was weird. I mean, he'd be normal and then he'd get real quiet and just leave the room. And
I
it's like
feel
what you'd
like
expect from something like that, you know? Most of the time,
mm,
he's just like on the treadmill drinking a beer, and then he'll just, he's got to be away from people.
it would be so interesting to know what he's like personally. Because when I look, honestly, when I look at the paintings, I see like, I'm like, is George Bush just like a tortured man who was born into this finance capitalist imperialist family and he didn't want to, but he's kind of charismatic. So he's like, you got to do it, George. And I don't want to run the country. All right, well, appoint Dick Cheney then. This guy, run shit for Halliburton. Have him be your vice president. He'll run shit. You can just paint. Like, okay. Fool me one time, shame on you.
When he was young, he was like all wild. He got caught doing coke a bunch, and he's an alcoholic. He's just like a good old boy in Texas, but the good type of good old boy that burned the crosses back in the day. The rich kind that doesn't want those types around him.
It's interesting. I used to not want to like dive into the personalities of these people, but the more you spend time in studying politics and studying economics, the more you realize that these are just people. They seem like insurmountable giants, but like you said, they put their pants on in the morning just like you. They take dumps just like you. And it's like, what kind of person would do this, would end up in this position? It's often people, like you said, who go to Yale, who are literally trained for this. They have these weird secret societies like the Skull and Bones Society where they learn, probably where they talk about, how they're the inheritors of ruling the world or whatever weird shit that they believe. But then they literally, run the State Department and run the most powerful bodies in global capitalism. And they're mass murderers who run around and get away scot-free. And I mean, to even make the point more about George Bush being like a tortured soul, he recently admitted that Iraq was an illegal and brutal intervention when he was trying to talk about Russia's military operation in Ukraine and accidentally let the truth come out and said, that the invasion of Iraq was brutal and illegal. And said, I mean, Ukraine. And he goes, well, Iraq too. I'm 75. He was saying like, I'm 75, and everyone laughed at that. Like, oh yeah, he's losing his marbles. But I think he was also saying like, I'm 75. I'll admit it. I don't give a shit anymore. Like
now that it can't hurt him, that it can't hurt upset their plans, it's fine because his focus is on
Ukraine,
Russia and Ukraine, and funding the Nazis in Ukraine.
Yes.
I think
everyone's an anti-imperialist in hindsight, even George Bush himself.
Precisely. There's a quote for you, brother. But it's Chris Hedges. Speaking of the Iraq War, he was talking about that a while after it, not too long after it, and he was talking about how these ruling class people, he actually grew up with them, and he had the interesting perspective of being a working class person who came from a poor family that got scholarships and grants to all these like elite schools, right? And he said that they don't treat people like people. Unless you're in their club, you are less than human to them. He remembered, he told a story when he wouldn't say who it was, but it was people in the Senate that were literally like chewing up pieces of gum and throwing them into a maid's hair. That's the kind of people that run our country. And I hate to get it back to organizing. Like, are we going to let that stand? For real? Are we going to let that stand?
Especially at a time when I don't think the American people have been as conscious of this ever before. And the potential that we have now, we had tremendous potential during the Reconstruction period, right before the counter-revolution of property in 1876. Tremendous potential, but nowhere near what we have now. Today, that force of racism, which was just completely impossible to get over at the time in the Reconstruction era, it's not as bad anymore. And in many places of the country has basically become obsolete, and the opposite is true. You have a a problem of over excessive white guilt,
Mm.
as opposed to how there's forms of racism that you had in the past. So I think that I teach in the poorest um, the poorest town in all of Illinois. Most of my students come from working class families, black, Hispanic, white, and the vast majority of them, understand these things, or at least are open enough to accepting them. And I've never seen that before, and I've been organizing for around 10 years, and it's just been progressively getting easier to convince people over to socialism. And it's a real shame when you look around and you see excuse me, I have a gang of chihuahuas in the background. When you see that there's institutions that have resources and power and could be doing a whole lot more to get to the people, just not doing it, and falling into the party politics and team politics that we have in the US.
The conditions for a revolution or an anti-imperialist uprising, socialist uprising are there, right? Like that energy for it's there. We just need a serious organization that we can send serious people to. Like, I know maybe some people don't like that I would criticize this, but look at the 2019 DSA convention, right? Like, DSA got really big, really popular. A lot of people joined DSA, but it was not a serious organization.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronoun?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
Okay,
First of all, in this room, I see that no one's clapping for me. It could be because I'm not engaging, but it also is because everyone's doing this. And that's really important, because those loud bursts of noise, even though this is a noisy space, when we can do something like reducing that, that's really important. So please don't clap, shoot up these. And additionally with the noise issue, like avoid hissing, avoid waving banners, right? If you don't know what to do, show up these, right? I'm sure there's lots of ways that we can communicate to each other without needing to rely on something that's going to hurt somebody else.
Point of information then?
Yes.
Okay, I'm old school, folks, and it's probably some technical problem that we can't solve. So my point of information is really a question. Is it possible that we do this the old-fashioned way and have the yeses on one side of the room and noes on the other? Would that be possible for the chair to do?
I would suggest not doing that because there's going to be a little bit too much motion.
Right, serious people who want to address the serious problems facing our country as a whole, these things that people recognize are legitimate crises that could devolve into nuclear war. They are turned away by like what they saw at DSA, which is basically a bunch of college students being hypersensitive, right? We need a serious party that understands the serious problems that we face and the path to changing them and fixing them. And I think that CPUSA can become that party, which is why I'm a member of CPUSA. I think that it can, through a process of becoming and through a process of development, becoming forged and hardened by struggle, it can become a serious party for serious people.
100%, brother. I have no doubt that we can be an integral part of the process of building this party into what it needs to be to lead the American people into the next thing. The people are ready, as we've just been talking about, as we see, and the conditions could not be more necessary for this. And the conditions, that nuclear Armageddon clock, for example, are what create the sort of hardening of a force like we're speaking of in the first place, right? The people are there. The people need this organization. All that is holding us back is ourselves at this point. The enemy of the left, and it's always been the case, has been the left, right? And we sort of try to live the criticism of the purity fetish, right? Carlos has a book on this coming out in a couple of days that I had the honor of editing. And I really think this book is giant. It's gigantic. It can change things. if we read it, if we take the idea seriously, and if we apply it in our organizing, in our lives, we can do precisely what Eddie was just saying. We can build this into what it needs to be to save our society.
Absolutely. And like Che Guevara has this theory that, you become a communist. You don't just, say you're a communist. It's a process of learning and developing and forging yourself in the struggle and learning lessons from engaging in the struggle. And, the same is true for a party, which is constituted of just a bunch of communists, a bunch of individuals coming together as a collective. So, yeah. And I mean, to the point about people, I mean, the energy being there for a revolution, like everybody understands the Iraq war was based on lies. Like George Bush is even admitting it in his speech. It's just, how do we hold them accountable? And like Noah said, it's people have to come to understand that we as the working mass have to hold them accountable. They're never going to hold themselves accountable. Their bourgeois laws mean nothing. The John Bolton, as well as other people in the Bush administration like Elliot Abrams, Paul Bremer, Paul Wolfowitz. These guys were pretty much the architects of neoconservatism, which is just conservatism with interventionist foreign policy. It's like an ideology cooked up in hell by the devil himself to be the worst ideology possible. And essentially, the Bush administration gave expression to this ideology in a political form. And the founding principle of the ideology, if you read what John Bolton actually wrote, is that U.S. domestic law and U.S. interests are above international law. International law essentially means nothing, and the U.S. can do whatever they want. It's just American exceptionalism in a legal form. And people recognize that this is been the modus operandi of the U.S. for the last few years. I mean, even CNN has an article, and this is actually a pretty good article, talking about why the war in Iraq was fought for big oil. I mean, it's not a secret anymore if even CNN is talking about it and admitting it. But I mean, the answer to this also shows that the answer to this is socialism, right? There's no anti-imperialism without socialism. Like we were saying, you can ally with the libertarians, right? But ultimately, the libertarians don't want to do anything about the big oil companies. Or maybe they want to bust them up, but they have an unrealistic way of doing it. All they want to do is decrease the size of government. They think everything will work out on its own. If you just get rid of the government, then the oil companies will just form private militaries, and they're going to do the same thing, only, with no regulation whatsoever. So the only way to end imperialism is to attack the relations of production, to attack the capitalist ruling class that justifies the imperialism, because as long as we hyper focus on the political, we're never going to see the root cause, and we're never going to see what's actually going on, because people, like we were saying earlier, treat the Iraq war like it was just one big mistake. It was just one big fumble because George Bush is such a dumb man. But the Iraq war had a winner. It wasn't lost. It was won by big oil. It was won by the finance capitalist class. They plundered Iraq. The Iraqi people say that they've had $150 billion stolen from them since the invasion, right? Pre-war Iraq, the oil was nationalized, and Saddam Hussein was asking for higher quotas for the U.S. to raise the price that they were buying it for, which is part of the reason the U.S. invaded. Post-war Iraq, all of their oil is owned by foreign firms, right? And before the nationalized oil, the surplus of that oil would be reinvested in Iraqi infrastructure, Iraqi homes, the Iraqi people, because it's their own resources and labor, of course. But after that, these foreign multinationals are extracting the surplus made from Iraq back to the West and accumulating. Meanwhile, Iraq is left in this devastated state where extremist groups fight in the power vacuum that the U.S. is kind of trying to stabilize. So it makes you wonder how they justified this like murderous slaughter that was so clearly just done to pillage Iraq's resources. But then you look at the invasions that have happened since then, like Libya, Syria, what's going on with the proxy war against Russia. Like, what's the difference? It's almost like people haven't learned their lesson, or I don't know, have they gotten better at lying? I don't know. Maybe I'm asking you guys.
Yeah, they always justify it in the same way, right? Freedom and democracy. We're saving these people. Yet the results are always the same. People die and things get horribly worse than they were beforehand. So even if that were the case, and let's be real, we all know it's not, that would no longer be a viable reason to do that. And that's why they're forced to sort of admit all these things after the fact and after they're no longer dangerous anymore. You know, I think, and on the point you made right before that, Eddie, which was a really good one, about sort of like people letting things get in the way of coming together, right? And libertarians and stuff. A lot of this, I think, boils down to utopianism. All of us disagree on a particular solution, a conclusion. When, if we're serious about fixing the problem, we need to identify the problem and then come up with what the best solution for the most amount of people is together. If we do that, libertarians become communists real quick, right? Because when you actually narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down, Marxism gives you the answers and not a lot else does.
I just wanted to give maybe a somewhat abrupt shift, but we were talking earlier about these war criminals, and what's interesting is that we can put 25 to 35 million people in the streets during the George Floyd protests because a man was brutally killed, by a racist police officer. And we can ask through that mass movement, not just for justice and police reform and those various things that were asked. Some more radical than others, but at their core, I think the basic level was that at least the people that were a part of it should get prison time. They should get punished for what they did. They killed a man. So I'm wondering whether it'd be a good idea or I don't know, to have like part of a socialist platform be jail all these war criminals. These people have killed millions of people. Jail them. Just because you don't have the clip of them, putting their knee on a person's neck until they die, doesn't mean that they haven't been behind decisions that have killed, women, children, men, teenagers, all sorts of people from all different colors and from all different, all sorts of people, millions of people, so it's, if we're thinking about, that component of justice with regards to these people, I'd say maybe something even worse would be more just. But I think at a basic level, like, have at least investigations to see who, what knowledge did they have before they did these things. And you'll find that they all knew that these fabrications, which were used to justify these wars and these crimes, that these people knew that they were fabricated. These people knew that these, drone strikes were killing 95% civilians or 90% civilians. They knew that, they knew that because they were in textbooks, in literal textbooks at the time that they were still doing it. So if there's any amount of justice, and if the American people can hit the streets in the millions, to protest against one, they should be able to do it against the other, where, millions of people are killed.
Yeah, or we could elect Liz Cheney to president, like Robert Reich said. I don't know what the approval rating of John Bolton and these former war criminals or just current war criminals are at. I'm sure they're not very well liked, but the progressives in America think that we should recycle them or have their children run for office again. Here's Robert Reich's other article, Liz Cheney for president, in which he argues that Liz Cheney would be a great president. Let the weapons contractors run things. We need some adults in the room.
It's like they're not even trying to hide that they're an aristocracy. It's wild, man.
And Robert Reich's considered like this progressive professor. It shows how ridiculous that is, and goes back to what we were saying before about all these people being in the same club.
Yeah, he's considered a leftist who goes on Democracy Now! All the time, and the truth is, he was he Clinton's Treasury Secretary, or I think he was Treasury Secretary, or like a labor relations guy, right? I forget, but yeah, he helped design Clinton's economic policies, which were disastrous for the American working class, not to mention the global working class. They were like NAFTA, and I don't want to go up on a whole sidetrack, but
we did a NAFTA segment in the last video because our buddy, the great socialist Voosh, said that he supports NAFTA, or that the ideas were good. So I had to explain to the audience how ridiculous that is, and most of them already got it, of course. But yeah, I do think like between the Iraq War and first the wars in Libya and Syria were technically NATO, right? What that's basically just the army of finance capital, right? And you can't just pin it on the U.S., even though most of these interventions are led by the U.S. State Department and Western or U.S.-based banks and capitalists and stuff. Having the intervention be led by NATO, it's less direct blame placed on U.S. citizens, or less shame that they feel about their country, because it's NATO doing it, not us. But I also think there's probably been an increase in the concentration of the means of communication, and just a decrease in the amount of people in the establishment media apparatus who have integrity. Right, there's less people like Seymour Hersh bouncing around. It's more just these think tank NGO freaking ghouls who will take anything handed to them by intelligence agencies, anything handed to them by NGOs or apparatuses that serve the deep state or serve finance capital, and they'll publish it and they'll circulate it. And one of the people who and now we're going to talk about the propaganda that was used to justify the pillage and murder that was the Iraq War. But one of the main controversies was Judith Miller, who was writing for the New York Times. She was spoon-fed stories about weapons of mass destruction by U.S. intelligence agencies directly. I believe it was by the CIA, and then published in the New York Times a story claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Not only that, she also exposed the identity of someone who was criticizing the war, which she actually ended up going to jail for before being pardoned by George Bush. Imagine that. And now she does videos for PragerU. But that was a huge scandal, and Judith Miller, eventually she went to jail for a little bit. She had to resign from the New York Times after 28 years. But now it's like you feel like corporate media is getting, or not corporate media, even sometimes outlets like the New York Times that are considered respected are getting their stories directly from the CIA. And maybe it's always been that way. Maybe I'm naive, but it seems like there's more control now, and social media maybe democratized things for a little bit, but now it's just flooded with freaking bots. What's that study we showed the other day? 60 to 80% of people talking about Ukraine, Russia are bots on Twitter. And then 90% of them are pro-Ukraine bots. So the discourse is literally flooded with NATO bots. Every avenue of information is controlled in some way. So I don't know. I feel like it's worse now, but maybe not.
I think it's different now. It's more sophisticated, and it's so much more ever present because the internet is ever present. It used to be that, CNN had CIA agents working there, right? But nowadays they've built the infrastructure that people that do the job that those CIA agents had to do it of their own free will. They've grown up in a place where this is just what creates them, right? And how they're formed. And worse, they believe they're being adversarial and sometimes even revolutionary while doing this, while doing precisely what intelligence agencies and our ruling class have created this sort of thing to do. Gabriel Raquel has a really good sort of thought device for it. And he says that, the CIA don't create puppets, right? They don't create marionettes, because to create marionettes, people aren't stupid. They see the strings, they see the puppet master, the CIA, and be above them or whatever. Instead, they build theaters, right? They control the theaters, who gets in, who gets promoted within the theaters, how long they get, etc. And then the marionettes come of their own accord, and it's self-selecting. And that's what Michael Parenti's book, Inventing Reality, is about, right? It was him noticing this at its very early stage. And if you think about how gamed that is and how easily gamed that is with social media, it's like they have the ability to alter our view of reality these days. And that's fucking terrifying.
Absolutely, especially if you consider, as I do at least, that we've entered into a new stage of identity formation. We very much, we've talked before about the analysis of Hans-Georg Moeller and Pauli Ambrosio on prophilicity. I teach their book in class, and the argument is that we've got into a stage of identity formation where people's personal identities, are tied to their profiles. And the development of their identity is tied to the development of curating their profile, and their profile is very much based on the reactions that they get from the people that are following them and the people that engage with their accounts. They call this the general peer. And when you have a situation where the Silicon Valley capitalists, in conjunction with the CIA and the FBI and the State Department institutions, are able to control the general peer, the interactions that are made with people's accounts, they're controlling, in essence, how it is that that person shapes their identity in relationship to how they are seen as being seen by everyone else, by the general peer. And so I would say that the main difference is that whereas in the early 2000s, there was still the capacity to somewhat separate the individual as the authentic individual. We were still under the paradigm of authenticity from their political views. They can go home and their political views were somewhat separated. Today, you don't have that. Today, you look at people's bios and it's their identity. They have the Ukraine flag. During the BLM protest, they put the black square. They just go with the flow of whatever the general peer is going with, and the general peer is fully controlled by capital, right? Not only in the sense of bots, but also in the sense of repressing, in the forms of banning, as we've experienced, in the forms of shadow bans, as we've experienced. And I did a concrete study about this where I lay out what prophilicity is and how it's used by imperialism in an article I called Imperialism and Prophilicity. And I look at the case of Bolivia, because in Bolivia, there was 69,000 bots that were found to shift the narrative during the 2019 coup against Evo Morales, which input Jenny Añez, a fascist, a literal fascist and racist, who had said tremendously racist things about the indigenous people in the area, and who, when she ran, she had like 3% of the vote that year, and they were able to successfully carry this out, not just through the repressive apparatuses of the state. It wasn't just force, but it was also shaping the narrative, which allowed the populace, which could have came out had they been able to, see the truth, to somewhat stay at home and to get, liberal-minded people who are very much moved by sentimentality and appeals to their liberal moralisms, to get those people to be quiet or to go with the flow in favor of the coup against Evo Morales, the first indigenous president ever, because they had those 69,000 bots. And then what it does in places like Twitter is that it makes things trend. And when things are trending, it goes from being bots that like have the likes and the shares and the quote tweets and the tweets to being real people. And the fakes are used as a medium so that more real people end up seeing this and shaping who they are, their identities and their political opinions in accordance with this mass control that the ruling class has over bots and over information today. So it's much more ingrained, much deeper, and much more insidious because people don't even realize that it's happening. So it's a battle unlike ever before.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we do with our TikTok organizing and outreach and stuff like that is important. But I mean, you see now how fast they've been able to ban us. And at the same time as these pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO bots are being pushed out, there are voices telling the truth that are being banned and suppressed. You had the Hamilton 68 dashboard that was exposed recently, where State Department connected think tank was pressuring Twitter to delete all these accounts that they said were Russian bots, but were in fact just people telling the truth. And TikTok deleted 30,000 accounts, which they said were all Russian bots. Of course, they weren't. It was people like us who had, nearly 400,000 followers on our Midwestern Marx account, which is what happens if you allow, a Marxist-Leninist message to actually get out without suppression, is it becomes very popular. So they have no choice but to suppress us. But now it's like instantly we can be banned because of how quickly these bots will find our account, and how quickly hate can be diverted towards us. They can do it just in a Discord server. People can coordinate a mass reporting campaign, and then there are literal NATO operatives and former State Department officials managing TikTok's content. So they're not going to do anything about it. Twitter, put up a little bit of resistance to that Hamilton 68 dashboard, but certainly not as much as they could. So it's really dark. And I remember watching TikTok kind of transform into this from an app that really had more freedom of speech into what it is now, is made me oh geez, do we have a chance here to win this propaganda war? We do, because every time we make a new TikTok account, it immediately blows up and we get thousands of followers because people want the truth. But it is going to be difficult. And like Carlos said, more so than I see bots posting things that go viral, you almost never see that. I almost never see an account that I think is a bot post something that goes viral. What I see is someone I know who posts something that I disagree with, or maybe lends itself to imperialism or liberalism, that explodes because bots are sent to like it. And then those people drift more towards posting stuff like that because they get this dopamine response. They get this serotonin from having their tweet or whatever liked by bots. So then, as Carlos said, that makes people more inclined, that changes how they think and who they are to be more like that. So you get a bunch of bots that just like people's tweets every time they say something imperialistic, and people are going to be more inclined to do that because it's fun to have people like your tweets and feel popular. And it's not fun to get attacked and be called a genocide denier and all these things.
And these people still have the gall of talking about the marketplace of ideas, the free marketplace of ideas. I often think, where would we, and, we've grown a lot over the last year or so, ever since we got banned, but where would we be if that 400K follower account was able to stay around and we were the only voice or one of the few voices on TikTok saying the truth about Ukraine? Where will we be in terms of our TikTok size and in terms of how TikTok functioned as a segue to promote the other parts of the institute, which include the website, but the other social media platforms, and now that we have a publishing press, our books, and our Patreon, the immense effect that has had on our project is something I often think about. And the difficulty is that I was talking with Noah about this the other day, and everyone is in these apps. Like TikTok is the fastest growing app and the most popular app in the United States. Unfortunately, whenever I go to the living room and my mom's home from work, even she's on TikTok. It's no longer like a little kid thing. It's everyone's on there, and we've been essentially banned from the most popular marketplace of ideas in the country. And it's just ridiculous. And if you say, well, let's make another app that's like, you have free speech and it's for socialists and all this other shit. Well, who's going to go on there? The point of these apps is that these are already where people are, and say that people go there, right? Say that at least the base goes there. Where would you host it? Because Apple has the power of removing the apps. Google has the power of removing the apps. Google and Bing have the power of not having your thing show up when you put it. So at all times, they have such a centralized control over the means of communication, the technological means of communication, that regardless of what counter response you make to their censorship, even if you make your own thing, it can pull the rug under you because even the floor is owned by them.
And this is why we always say, Organization begins in your workplace. It doesn't begin with arguing online or like ratioing someone on Twitter or whatever you want to do. It begins in your workplace. From there, broader organizations can coordinate things like this. Because Google can do this because Google can do this to us now does not mean that will always be the case. We are capable of fighting back. We are smart enough to do it, and we are strong enough to do it. What it takes is the dedication, the will, and the organization.